Anybody else in here from Kansas City? All right. So you're rooting for the Royals, right? Oh yeah. Anybody from San Francisco? No, I don't see any hands go up. Good question, though. All right, now I'd like to introduce our next presenters, Dr. Jason Obey and Dr. Jane Perkins from Music.
Okay. I'm here to talk about the poem and the song by Poulenc called Bleuet. This first slide here is a representation of a French World War I soldier, and he is depicted here in a field of cornflowers. The word bleuet actually means cornflower, and you can see the color of the cornflowers is similar to the blue color of the light blue uniforms that the French soldiers wore. So a nickname for a French soldier was a bleuet, yeah, or a blue. And also the word bleu in French means blue, of course, but bleuet is a diminutive, so it makes it nicer or more loving or a more intimate term. Okay. How do I change these slides on this? Oh, never mind, I think I got it. Okay, here is Guillaume Apollinaire, and as you can see his dates, he dies in 1918. He was a poet. He was born in Rome, actually, in 1880. He kept his parentage clouded in speculation, but he was most likely the illegitimate child of Angelica Kostowicki, who was a Polish woman living in the Vatican. So he was likely maybe the son of a priest who had had an illicit affair with a woman who was on the Vatican grounds. He was raised in the gambling halls of Monaco, Paris, and in the French Riviera during his education in Cannes, Nice, and Monaco. He just assumed an identity. He made something up. He was calling himself a Russian prince and made people believe that. In his 20s, he worked for a Parisian bank and kept company with all of the famous artists that we know today from that time period, like Picasso and Georges Braque and Marc Chagall, Max Jacob, Eric Satie, who was a composer, Marcel Duchamp, and the woman who was his lover, Marie Laurencin. During this time, he published a number of semi-pornographic books proclaiming that the writings of Marquis de Sade would claim prominence in the new century, which would be, of course, the 20th century at that time. His first collection of poetry, called L'Enchanteur Pourrissant, appeared in 1909, and his reputation was established in 1913 with a book called Alcools, which was a collection of classical versification and modern imagery, the combination of the two. He was known as a thief for a period of time. In fact, he was detained for a week in 1911 on the suspicion of having stolen the Mona Lisa. And he decided to become a French national and did so by enlisting in the infantry during World War I. He was stationed on the front in Champagne until 1916 when he suffered a head wound. And he outlined his poetic and political beliefs in a book called L'Esprit Nouveau, or The New Spirit, et les Poètes and the Poets, in 1917. In 1918, after a series of short-lived affairs with a number of women, he married a woman named Jacqueline Kolb. By this time, he was weakened by the war, and he died shortly after a bout with the Spanish flu on November the 9th of 1918 in Paris. There is a book called Calligram, which is a collection of concrete poetry, was published a few months after his death. And a calligram is when you take the words of a poem or some part of words and you put it together so that the appearance of it seems to mirror or to exemplify what the text means. So let's look at a little bit of that before we move on. Here we go. These are some pictures of Apollinaire. As I mentioned to you, he hung around a lot with artists. And these are some renderings of him by some of his friends. Here he is with Poulenc, who was obviously later. Poulenc died in 1963. And he wrote this song that I'm going to sing when we were on the eve of the Second World War. Okay? Here's some pictures of Apollinaire in his French soldier's uniform. And here are some pictures of him after his wounds from being on the front. And here are the colograms I was talking about, okay? Now this, although it's very blurry, because that was the best picture I could find, this is actually a collogram of the poem that I'm going to sing. And you can see you've got some words on one side and these on the other, as though they are opposing forces in a battle. Yeah. I'm left-handed, so this is a challenge for me. Why not just move to the left side, Jason? That works. Okay. Alrighty. So I want to talk to you about the poem before I sing it. Jeune homme de 20 ans qui a vu des choses si affreuses, que penses-tu des hommes de ton enfance? A young man of 20 years who's seen such dreadful things. What do you think of the men of your youth? Let me come back to that. I'm going to go back a little bit to his biography and we'll come back to the poem itself. Apollinaire was an important part of several avant-garde movements in French literature and art at the start of the 20th century. His influences include the symbolist poets of the former generation such as Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, Guy Laforgue, and Tristan Corbière. His work is often concerned with the clash between the modern and the traditional, often just juxtaposing drastically different stylistic elements. It exhibits a gritty modern imagery and, however, presented in a traditional form. For example, his book about Cubists that he wrote in 1913 expounded on the theory behind Cubism and analyzed the work of important Cubists. And his play, called La Mamelle de Tiresias, which later became an opera written by Poulenc, has to do with femininity and the definitions of that, and that actually means the breasts of Tiresias, and at the end of the opera, her bosoms actually kind of fly away. She don't need those anymore. Let me get rid of that stuff. He was witness to the war of attrition, which set young men over the top at a certain time of day, which in this poem is 17 hours, 17 or 5 o'clock in the evening. And at this time, this really meant that they were going to be facing almost certain death as they struggled to storm the enemy position and take a few yards of muddy terrain. It reminds me very much of the images and movies I've seen about the Civil War in the United States. You know, how the war methods were so primitive that if you were on that front line and going out, it was almost for sure that you would die. When composing this song, Poulenc himself heard that his friend André Bonnelly, a young soldier from Amboise, and the composer Poulenc had known him since he was a child, this man who died. Poulenc heard that he'd been killed in action. He later found out that it was not true, but he wrote this poem and dedicated the song to him anyway. Last summer, in 2013, I was in Los Angeles for a few weeks on a study grant that I'd received gratefully from TSU to study art song. And one of the primary facilitators this was a man by the name of Graham Johnson. Graham Johnson is English. He's elderly now. He played as an accompanist for many extremely well-known singers of classical art song, and among them Pierre Bernac, who was a baritone, and recorded with them. Poulenc was one of the first composers to recognize the importance of recording, and he recorded a whole bunch. So we have a lot of examples of Poulenc on the piano. He was a very much accomplished pianist. Graham Johnson is a scholar at this point. He still plays the piano, he's still active, but he does a lot of teaching and so forth. Graham Johnson was homosexual. as was Poulenc. And he wrote this that I'm about to read to you about this poem and Poulenc and this particular poem. And I think it's worth, I mention his sexuality because I think it's reflected in this writing that he has here. This comes from Graham Johnson. As a gay man, Poulenc had two types, masculine and stocky, like his longtime companion Raymond Destouches, who was a professional chauffeur, and the other younger and more dependent, like Lucien Roubert, with whom the composer was in love during the composition of Dialogues of the Carmelites. Dialogues of the Carmelites is one of Poulenc's great operas. It's set in the French Revolution. And at the end of the opera, the chorus of these nuns is singing as they're marching off to the guillotine. So it's quite a dramatic effect, because as the chorus dwindles down one by one, and you hear the slashing of the guillotine, and by the end it's one lone voice of all these women who've lost their heads. And it's roughly in the same time period that he was writing for this, and I'm going to tell you some more about that in a second. So this, going back to Graham Johnson. So this young man, Lucien Robert, died as Poulenc kept vigil by his bedside while completing the moving final scene of this opera that I was just describing to you. The unknown soldier of this song clearly falls into the second category, a hero who might also have been one of the composer's fallen angels. Like some of the greatest war poems of Wilfred Owen, Bleuet is subtly homoerotic. It achieves its lyricism via the composer's tender engagement, only at a distance, of course, with the young soldier, a Bleuet, being a diminutive of blue, the nickname of an enlisted man due to the blue-gray color of his uniform. Poulenc wrote a number of Éloire settings that pay tribute to the strength and poetry of heterosexual relationships. It would have been extraordinary if his output had not included at least one song addressed to a jeune homme, a young man, and this is the only one. Of course, it is possible for a heterosexual man to write tenderly of the pity of war and the senseless loss of young men. After all, Apollinaire, who wrote the poem, was a heterosexual man, and that's proof enough. But Poulenc's music, uniquely conceived for tenor, and I want to say at this point, as a voice teacher and as a singer, all of Poulenc's songs are written for sopranos, and there are quite a few male songs, so they're all written for baritone. This is the only song that I know of that's written for tenor by Poulenc. It employs an ethereal, youthful tessitura. Tessitura has to do with the range of the voice, which seems to come from another world where the lovers caress and the other comrades salute are interchangeable. In this miniature war requiem, there are moments of determination and manliness, although the composer never forgets the soldier is 17 and not 30. But it is the sweetness, the humble readiness to die, the yielding to fate, all conveyed in the music that break the heart. The final section, a kind of a hushed epilogue. What's wrong?
Just timing. Keep time in mind.
Okay, I'm almost finished. It's impressive. Poulenc writes movingly of the mysterious moment when leaving the mortal remains of the vestiary of the soul flies away after long last look at the sweetness of other times passed by. And of course, Poulenc himself, who glances back at this young man, a hero of la patrie, or the country, a martyr for his loved ones, and the ghost of all the young men the composer had loved and lost. Some like this, an imagined time and place, all others in real life. Just to talk to you briefly about Poulenc, who died in 1899 to 1963, was born into a wealthy family, and he was expected to enter into a business career and was not allowed to enroll in music college. Therefore, he was self-trained as a musician and was greatly influenced by Erik Satie, and he became one of the group of 6 composers known as Les Six, which is a group of French composers that wrote during this same time period. In his early works, Poulenc became known for his high spirits and irreverence, and during the 30s, a much more serious side to his nature emerged, particularly in the religious music that he started composing in 1936 and onward. In addition to composing, Poulenc was an accomplished pianist, and he's particularly known for performing partnerships with the baritone Pierre Barnac, and he toured Europe and America making many recordings, as I said. And he was among the first composers to see the importance of the gramophone and recorded extensively after 1928. In his later years and for many years thereafter, and his death, Poulenc's reputation as a composer, particularly in France, was frequently kind of not thought of very highly, thought of just as kind of lightweight music, but his religious music was even overlooked altogether. But now in the 21st century and so forth, his music, particularly his religious music, is being performed much more often. Operas like the Dialogues of the Carmelites are being recorded and performed much more often. He wrote this song that I'm going to sing for you right now. Let me tell you, the song's going to be a lot briefer than my speech is, so just you'll be okay. In 1939, in October, that was 1 month after Hitler initiated World War II by invading Poland. French soldiers were mobilized and rushed to their formations behind their defensive lines, and there was a great patriotic sentiment. There was little loss at this point because Hitler had held off turning west until late spring of 1940. Yet Poulenc responded to the fact that the hundreds of thousands of young men were prepared to sacrifice themselves, and they anticipated that many of them would lose their lives. He turned to this poem, written by Guillaume Apollinaire in 1917 at the height of France's World War I. The poet wrote it after being returned from the front after suffering a head wound. I showed you a picture of that. The poem addresses a young man of 20 and is essentially a lament of lost innocence as a soldier watches his comrades fall around him. Because of the color of his uniform, the French soldier was often called a bleu, and bleuet is a diminutive of the word bleu, and is also the name of the light blue cornflowers similar in color to those uniforms that were used in France at the time. The poet addresses his soldier in this way. Okay? The cornflower of France is also a commemorative symbol of the First World War, and it's also the nickname given to young soldiers of war, their uniforms light blue in color. Just to end with a quote from Poulenc in his own discussion of this song in a journal, he says, it's clear that he was concerned to avoid many of the traditional trappings of music regarding soldiers and death and battle. There's no martial music and no heroics. There is no religious solemnity. And these are Poulenc's words. I was quite simply moved to the depths of my being by the intensely human overtones of Apollinaire's poem. Humility, whether it concerns prayer or the sacrifice of a life, is what touches me most. Now, on that note, I won't read the poem to you, but I'll leave the translation up so you can look at it as I sing. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Dr. Perkins, up to play. Leave my water up there. The end.
Thank you, Dr. Oakley and Dr. Perkins. Give Dr. Perkins a hand as well. We're going to move on to our panel, student panel. Literature's response to the war. Panel members, will you come forward? We have places here. We have, first is Professor James Ford.
Excuse me. Should we take the piano up now? It's got to go back to our building before they start, or would you like us to make arrangements that
Either way,
fellas?
James Ford, Warren Brown, Jennifer Julian, members of our student panel. Mr. Ford here is also a professor here, right?
No.
Teaching somewhere?
Somewhere.
Okay, so our panel members took part in a course this past summer on modernism, and a part of that course is modern poetry. And part of that course focused on, of course, the poets of World War I. And so I'll leave that to the panel members. Who's going to start? Mr. Ford?
I'm going to be able to get one of these.
Yes, you want to project something?
Yeah.
Here, let me have it. Let's see, how do we, in slideshow, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
In slideshow, click to exit, I'm talking to everyone on the microphone. Will they all get this going? Let's see, is that one of you?
That's not mine.
It's in there, so, all right, cancel, open,
There it is.
T,
That's it. Come down to the Halloween. Yeah,
okay,
there
all right, take it away.
we go. Good morning. I'm James Ford, and I hadn't had a chance to actually go over this, so you all will be first to hear this my way. I remember one Easter a number of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 actually. I was asked to be a part of an Easter program, and this was my Easter suit and my Easter shoes. And so when you go to Easter back in the old days, you know, you would go to the sermon and you would hear a sermon, and then later on there would be a program. And to put you in the proper mood, I had to change the picture so you can see that it's at church. And I remember shortly after the preacher had given a sermon talking about, I'm sure he talked about all the ills of mankind, sex out of wedlock, gambling, lying, cheating, stealing, and all those kinds of things. And then we came back into the portion where the program was, and I actually got up and recited the Hollow Men. Now, I guess I was 13 or 14 years old, but I had already memorized the poem. Mr. Kurtz, he dead, a penny for the old guy. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dried voices as we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass. And I love that poem because of its free verse, its fragmentation, because it had a beat to it, and I fell into its beat, and I used to recite this poem all the time. And after I finished with the poem, the minister got up, and I think I probably was last on the program. He looked at me very strangely, and he said, "Well, we'd like to thank Mr. Ford for his reciting T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men." And it was almost like he maybe had been sitting over there praying, and I remember my mother, before he got up, she actually said, "Go, boy." And then all of a sudden, the preacher raised his hands again, and as if he was praying, but it made me feel like I had drugged the devil right into the church after I had finished The Hollow Men. Now, I must tell you that since I've been at TSU as a student, I've learned more about The Hollow Men than I knew back those few years ago when I actually did recite this poem. First of all, at the very beginning of this poem, we have a couple of epigraphs. We have "Mr. Kurtz, he dead." This is Joseph Conrad. This is in reference to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. A penny for the old guy. Back when I recited this poem, I thought it was a penny for the old guy who was dead. Not true. It's for Guy Fawkes, who attempted to blow up the Parliament in Great Britain. And the children would go around on Guy Fawkes Day and try to get pennies for people so they could buy explosions and firecrackers and those kinds of things. And so that was a part of this. The old guy is Guy Fawkes. We are the hollow men, stuffed men. These guys are pretty much dead, right? They are hollow. They are stuffed. And the only words that they can say is, "Alas. Alas," our dried voices. I had not planned to do the entire poem here, but I kind of wanted to point out several sections here that were pretty important. When I was growing up and reciting this poem, I didn't realize that there was sex in here. And maybe that's why the preacher got up and looked so funny when he looked at me. Let me see if I can find that section and point it out to you. It says, "It is like this in death's other kingdom, waking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone." TSU taught me that part. And then finally, there are a couple of other places that I find very important. And had the preacher, if I knew where he was today, I would probably point this out to him, that this poem actually talks about no hope. And it talks about all of the things that he probably talked about in his sermon. Everybody's probably had a chance to sing this song when you were growing up. "Here we go round the mulberry bush." Well, this particular part is from Eliot. He says, "Here we go round the prickly pear, the prickly pear, the prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning." Some of you who have been paying attention, you know that this reference of 5 o'clock in the morning is to Jesus' resurrection. And so it does have some religious tones to it. In fact, not only does it have religious tones there, if we look farther It says, for thine is the kingdom, for thine is life, for thine is thee. And these are the fragmentations where Eliot breaks this poem up. But he's still talking about hope, the loss of hope. If we back up one or two places, he says, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response falls the shadow. They're paralyzed. Life is very long. He says, between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. It's paralyzed again. No hope. For thine is, life is. And we finally get to the end of the poem, and this probably is the most quoted part ever. And I can remember standing there in church saying, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Torrin Brown, and the poem I've chosen is The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. And it goes, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. When you read this poem, it creates an image of a farm. Some of you might have farms, this is Texas, and when you look at the poem, the images show a type of peaceful, it's agrarian. There's no, after the war, we've seen devastation, destruction, death. But Carlos Williams is painting a picture where there seems to be peace. There's the red wheelbarrow, a simple object, but so much depends on it. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow because you can transport, you can move, you can pick up the soil that can go with your farming, you can transport tools. And some people wonder why it's a red wheelbarrow. What does the color red symbolize? Some believe that it symbolizes blood. The workers are constantly working, they're sweating, they're doing their hardest work to work on the farm. Another way the color can be described is red symbolizes power. So much depends on this wheelbarrow. It has so much going for it. It's glazed with rainwater. Some might be thinking, what does the rainwater symbolize? At the time, this water is in the barrel. You can drink it. You can use it to use your soil. You can use it to help the chickens, the other animals that are also there on the farm, horses, pigs, etc. Besides the white chickens symbolizes hens, eggs, feathers. You can use all these in different ways to sustain what the farm uses. The farmer can use all these things to survive. How does this relate to World War I? At this time, the advancement of technology has separated most individuals from one another. They're not a cohesive unit anymore. But Williams is painting a picture where there's a unity. Farmers work together to build up, not to destroy, but to... Need to stop talking with my hands. Need to, stay together. And when we look at it, it also doesn't talk about how modern it is. When you think of something that happened a long time ago. But by Carlos Williams not talking about what we see, what's going on after the war, it reaches to your heart. It's like, well, I don't have to worry about walking down the street getting shot, or I don't have to worry about working with someone and not knowing that, once this is over, we're going separate ways. Instead of, we have a unity with one another. And the way I see it being influenced by the World War is because the World War separated us. Cars separated us. We go to work And Dr. Scholars, when you were growing up, how many people did you know outside of work where you would hang out with them or talk to them or just see them outside of work?
Quite a few at that time.
But the way I see Carlos Williams saying is, by working on the farm, we have to work together. I can't lift a 300-pound bag of soil. I need a coworker. I spend time with that person. I get to know his family, his children. If I get I'm trying to think of an example. I'm not a farmer, I'm sorry, from the north side. But if I sell a horse, I can't do it by myself. So can you help me? We'll split the profit, not every man for themselves. So the way this poem is saying is that he's longing for something simple, something that we don't see anymore. We don't see it after World War. And that's Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jennifer Julian, and I have two poems. One by Thomas Hardy called Men Who March Away, which was composed in 1914 at the beginning of World War I, and The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, which is a response to World War I. Men who march away. What of the faith and fire within us, men who march away? Ere the barn cocks say, night is growing gray, leaving all that here can win us. What of the faith and fire within us, men who march away? Is it a pure blind prank, oh think you, friend with the musing eye, who watch us stepping by with doubt and dolorous sigh? Can much pondering so hoodwink you? Is it a pure blind prank, oh think you, friend with the musing eye? Nay, we well see what we are doing, though some may not see, dalliers as they be. England's need are we. Her distress would leave us ruined. Nay, we well see what we are doing, though some may not see. In our heart of hearts believing, victory crowns the just, and that braggarts must surely bite the dust. Press we to the field ungrieving, in our heart of hearts believing, victory crowns the just. Hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away. Ere the barn cocks say, night is growing gray, leaving all that here can win us. Hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away. At the beginning of World War I, you had everyone within England fallen into this patriotic spirit of camaraderie for their country. You had noblemen, you had the laborer, you had workers, chimney sweeps, you had people who we would consider children now, who lied to get into service and go off to war to defend their country. A lot of the phrases that we hear in this poem, we use them today. Probably never knew where we got them from, like bite the dust, or pure blind luck, or musing eye, or in our heart of hearts. Thomas Hardy wrote this poem between September 5th, 1914 and October the 10th. It is also known as the Song of the Soldiers. Usually, a young man or maybe his parents would hum this song to the Battle Hymn of the Republic as they were going off to war. Now we go for The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, a very different poem. This poem is a reaction after the war. It was written in 1926, and it references what was known as the lost generation, men and women who came of age during World War I. These were the lost souls who didn't know what to do with their lives after being in war for so long. Children who were carefree before the war became adults who left their homes, who engaged in wild, scandalous parties, who got married, got divorced, had affairs, and didn't care what was going on. They basically tried to break their parents' hearts while looking for who they really were.
Another term for the decade that this was written in is called the Roaring Twenties, the era right before Prohibition, because these young people were flappers. They were the people that you find in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, in Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, in all of the stories about race, about dedication, about being lost. You found them in this generation. I'm just going to read the first part because this is like 20 parts long. The Burial of the Dead from the Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. For Ezra Pound, Il Miglior Fabbro. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the starboard sea with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Ben gar kan ruschen, stam ausgluchen et dusch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousin's, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went in the mountains. There you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of the stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess. For you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock, coming under the shadow of this red rock. And I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Verschwet begin, de heimet zu, mijn ijskijn verkwast du. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. T.S. Eliot held a very interesting position in the literary world. He was an American and he was also Briton. If you have started taking World Lit, you will find him at least twice in your books. He was against the war, but he was mostly against it because he saw the effects, the psychological damage, the physical damage done to people of his generation. You had young men who came back who couldn't have children. You had women who came back who were burned. You had people who just didn't know who they were. And this was his response to the national identity that had been force-fed to them all of their lives. Thank you.
Thank our three panelists. Thank you very much for your participation. Now we are going to ask Professor Donna Kilgore. So let's see if we have this
Set up here.
set up now. You want to is this yours?
Yeah, I want to,
That last one.
okay, hold on, I'll have to close this program out though.
You want to start at the beginning? Thank you, everyone. We're going to convene again at 12 for the next session.
Oh, she's Jermaine Lenore.
Over there there's a sheet over there for English. Just put your name on the English sheet. Let's see. Did I give you a program?
It's just something that the department itself had her do. And she didn't finish it, so now they make her go back to school and do 3 hours to get a degree. Yeah, I know it is.
There's a sheet over here for English to sign in. Hey, thanks for coming though. One sheet for English. Tablet up there. Somebody took the tablet. Anybody have the tablet?
Sign in 501. English.
That's fine. I'll find your name.
I only need to read it when Dr. Salman left. He just started.
He started the other side.
Okay, I will just put my name there too.
Yes,
Okay,
uh-huh.
sure.
Great job. Very memorable poem. Oh. that? No, you're gonna do yours first. No, we can't. Let's see. I'm gonna see if, Mr. Green can wait after yours. I'm gonna see.
I know, you're the filler.
National World War I Museum in Kansas City. So, I have a lot of photographs. Those are just some of the ones that selected. Gouging each other. Helping the young lady I'm gonna get yours on the. Right over there, just. Yeah, just one of the English sheets. I have a tablet over here. I ran off my tablet. It had all that names on it.
You were like, unlock that door. Lock that. That's how you can unlock that door. Yes, I'm saying, is that right? You can unlock it.
I'd rather they go over there.
Yeah, that's what, that was locking too.
There's no way to unlock it.
This is Watergate stuff.
Well, this one's opening now.
Close, probably close all the way. Go out, let me see if I can.
You'll be stuck. Hello. Hi. How are you doing? Nice.
It stayed up there without the...
I put it on, yeah,
Oh, good for you.
It's already
Thank you.
loaded in.
Great, thank you. If you... Coming. Yeah. Oh, you see?
All kinds of names on it, students' names.
Oh, no.
Yeah, well,
Who's over there on the table? Wasn't it? Somebody needed a tablet, you know that, right?
they could at least torn off the sheet.
No.
I'm glad to see so many familiar faces, students. Welcome, and I'm glad you're attending this afternoon session. 12 o'clock? Yeah, 12 o'clock, so appreciate you skipping lunch to gain knowledge, gain insights. And of course, we want the Royals to win, right? Anybody from KC? Anybody from St. Louis? I mean, not St. Louis, San Francisco. No? Well, I hail from KC. I'm rooting for the Royals. So we're gonna get started here in a couple of minutes. We have first off for this session on remembering World War I, 1914 to 1918. We have Professor Donna Kilgore from the English department, a poet, a lecturer, and a terrific individual.
Thank you. My mother would appreciate that as well. Thank you.
So I'll let you
Get started. Good afternoon. Thank you. The poet that I'm going to discuss today is Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen was a dichotomy as a poet. He was a war hero, but he didn't like war. And one of the things about his poetry that I think is interesting is that he gives us great imagery. He makes you feel what it is like to actually be on the battlefield, to see the battle scene, to see people die. And the poems I have show a progression. It starts with the idealistic look of a person who looks at war as something that might be glorious and great, to one actually seeing what it is like on the battlefield. And then the final stage is those who come back from war who do not come back in the same shape that they left in the first place. So Wilfred Owen's poems, I call him an anti-war poet. He was a decorated poet. He was all that, but he still was not especially in favor of war. Here we have with Wilfred Owen. I'm not wearing my glasses. Wilfred Owen was born in Shropshire, England. He enlisted in what they call the Writers' Corps, and also he was wounded in combat. He suffered a head injury and a concussion, and they said that one of the first terms, when they termed people shell-shocked, he was said to have been a shell-shocked a war survivor. And he was awarded the Military Cross, which is a really big deal, and they said it was an honor that he felt was a dubious honor because he didn't like war anyway. For somebody to give him a reward for something he didn't like or something that he disapproved of was ironic. Anyway, one of the first poems that I want to discuss is called Arms and the Boy, and it basically discusses how people have an idealistic view of what war is all about. especially before one even engages. Let the boy try this bayonet blade, how cold steel is and keen with hunger of blood. Blue with all malice like a madman's flash, and thinly drawn with famishing for flesh. Lend him to stroke those blind, blunt bullet heads which long to muzzle in the hearts of lads. Or give him cartridges of fine zinc teeth, sharp with the sharpness of grief and death. For his teeth seem for laughing round an apple. There lurk no claws behind his fingers supple, and God will grow no talons at his heels, nor antlers through the thickness of his curls. And basically the poem is saying, human beings are not made for war. We don't have the weapons, the natural weapons. We've made those ourselves. Nature gives those who fight the weapons to fight with. Man is not supposed to fight. Okay. Quite possibly his most famous poem is this one. It's called Dulce e Decorum Est. It's also an anti-war poem. This is the one that gives you a graphic illustration of what it was like for soldiers at that time. The main danger they had was mustard gas. And so anytime they had to worry about mustard gas, pepper gas, spray gas, any gases, that's what they were dying from. And Wilfred Owen gives a depiction of what it is like for a soldier to die from suffering the gases. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the musty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Trying to get to him. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce est decorum est, pro patria mori. It is good and sweet to die for one's country. I'm not having much success here. And the final poem is a poem called Disabled. He sat in a wheelchair waiting for dark and shivered in his ghastly suit of gray, legless, sewn, short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, town used to swing so gay when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees and girls danced lovelier as the air grew dim. In the old times before he threw away his knees, now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. There was an artist silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. Now he is old. His back will never brace. He's lost his color very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race and left a purple spurting from his thighs. One time he liked a blood smear down his leg after the matches. I think it's supposed to go further down. One time he liked a blood smear down his leg after the matches carried shoulder high. It was after football when he drunk a peg. He thought he'd better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look good in kilts. That's why, and maybe too, to please his Meg. Aye, that was it, to please the giddy Jets. He asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans, he scarcely thought of at all, their guilt, and Austrians did not move him, and no fears of fear came yet. He draught of jewel heels for daggers and plaid socks, of smart salutes, and care of arms, and leave, and pay emirs, esprit de corps, and hints for young recruits, and soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but now not as crowds cheer gold. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits, thanked him, and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sickly years in institutes and do what things the rules consider wise and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? And the poem is basically about those forgotten in the aftermath of war, the ones who have the wounded who come home and the neglect that they see. But also he talks about the false bravado, going to war to impress a girl, going to war because someone said he'll look good in a uniform, and then the same people he was trying to impress when he comes back, they look at him as though he has a disease, and the women go and look for men who are whole. So anyway, that's the final irony of Wilfred Owen, though, is that he died a week before Armistice Day, almost to the day. So if he had lasted one more week, he would have outlasted the war that killed him, the war that he was writing about. But he died in service. And so although our war poetry he wrote, ironically told what his fate was going to be. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Donna Kilgore. Now we'd like to ask Professor Lyman Green to present his Artistic Landscapes and Colorblind Death. If we can see.
Good afternoon. I'm Professor Green. I'm with the Department of Visual and Performing Arts, and I'd like to present this afternoon a little bit of, I guess, the visual arts before, during, and after World War I. It was certainly a turbulent time in the world, you know, in those years preceding the war, during and after. In the arts, there was kind of a bubbling over of different objectives. Artists were frustrated with society. They were frustrated with life in general, especially in Europe. There was different factions came about, you know, both before and after the war. so many so that it's kind of hard to explain in just a few minutes, you know. So rather than do that, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the prominent factions in Europe, and then of course African American artists of that time. So this is basically the beginning of what we call modernism. Modernism in the art roughly lasted about 50 years. You know, it covers everything from the turn of the century, and you've probably heard of Cubism, all the way up to pop art in the 1960s. You know, and I like to refer to it as as just the time of isms. There were just so many different things going on, kind of at the same time, and of course everything had a different name, a different philosophy, and so forth. But basically modernism was kind of the point where artists began to investigate the medium, the material they were using a lot closer, you know, and trying to experiment along those lines. You know, so you can think of modernism as kind of this big umbrella, and then underneath the umbrella you have all these different factions going on. So there was surrealism, expressionism, abstraction, cubism, and as I said before, there were a lot more. You know, so probably in Europe the most dominant types were surrealism and expressionism. You know, and I'll begin with expressionism. Basically, artists in Northern Europe primarily began to think a lot about the unconscious, you know, and how like psychology and so forth plays a part in everybody's lives. And they wanted to infuse that into their art. So their artwork became very stylized, not so representational, a lot of very high-key color. So one of the artists, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, was kind of a leader in this area. He lived from 1880 to about 1938. So he saw the war, saw the aftermath, and he was German, Austrian actually. And he lived in Berlin. So he founded a kind of subgroup of expressionism called Die Brücke, the bridge. And this group primarily followed the writings of, I think it's Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, yes. I never know how to pronounce things. But anyway, particularly, thus spoke Zarathustra. And it talked about, this book talked about the humanity's potential to be kind of an evolutionary bridge, you know. And in Berlin at this time, there was a lot of corruption going on, a lot of kind of partying, basically, you know. And so in this painting, he's depicting prostitutes kind of walking the streets with their clients looking on or looking away. But one of the interesting things about this is that nobody's looking at each other. You know, there's kind of this alienation going on. The composition, this slide is probably a little bit faded, but the composition features very high-key colors. You know, very kind of aggressive, intentional reds, greens that clash with one another. You know, so the painting, if you were to see it in person, would be very disturbing looking. You know, but you can get some of that feeling from the kind of angular drawing style, you know. So another person who was a very famous artist is Kathy Kollwitz, and she's often put into the expressionist category, although she was kind of independent. She was a noted pacifist. She was also a wonderful draftsman, drawer, but she liked to depict historical events as they related to current times. You know, so here, this is an etching, part of a series that dealt with the Peasants' War from 1525. And the peasants were revolting against their living conditions as well as their jobs, labors, you know. And they were ultimately defeated, you know. So Kollwitz looked upon this as kind of a heroic, noble effort, you know, and pictured with her arms upraised is Dark Anna, you know, one of the principal figures of the war who was urging on, you know, the peasants. So I think I have another slide of hers. On the left here is another version of this series titled The Prisoners, and it's etching and kind of in the, I don't know if you can make it out, but right in this area here is her son. She depicted her son in this. And he died, ended up dying a few years later. In the bottom right is a self-portrait. And you can kind of see the anguished look about the artist's face, kind of contemplating her world in a sense, which was very turbulent, you know. In 1910, she was, as I said, a noted pacifist. She abhorred war, and yet she could see it coming, you know, as many of the artists could of this time. So Otto Dix, it's another artist of the Expressionist period, and he was actually a soldier. He experienced the war firsthand, the trenches, and like many of the Germans, he signed up for the war believing it was a very noble cause, you know, and once he enlisted and was actually on the front lines, experienced the disease, experienced the death all around him, you know, and tried to, following the war, he survived somewhat intact. He had nightmares, obviously, afterwards, and was hospitalized from time to time. But he decided to create a series of artworks that basically reported his experiences. So that's what's depicted here. On the left, you have the foxhole, so the bunker that the soldiers were in, you know, which was very, very, very cramped and dark and lit by just lamplight. And on the bottom right, you have soldiers returning, you know, in their various conditions, very disturbed, as well as physically impaired conditions, you know. So many believe that Otto Dix was trying to kind of heal himself through this, but he was very, very, very adamant about, he just wanted to report, you know, these were just visualizations of what he experienced, you know, so, which wasn't at all a very noble or heroic time, you know, so, let's see. So, those are just a couple three artists from the European side. In America, there was most of the art was very realistic and would follow the Impressionist style, you know, very pleasing. You recall that the United States didn't enter the war until later in 1917, but kind of wanted to be isolationist. Well, anyway, in 1913 there was the Armory Show, you know, and this became a pivotal point in art history because this was America's introduction to the works that were being created in Europe. You know, so this was the first time Americans experienced Cubism, the first time they encountered Matisse, Picasso, all the big names that were currently working in Europe. You know, and it was a very large exhibition. There was somewhere between 1,200 and 1,300 artworks on display. So this exhibition was roundly criticized, you know, in the press. It actually traveled to Chicago, where they, at the Art Institute of Chicago, I believe, they burned some of the artists in effigy. You know, it was that much of a controversy. But nevertheless, artists actually investigated the Cubist styles, the Fauvism that they saw, and began to emulate it and make it their own. You know, so I decided to include. Well, this is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, a very famous artwork that kind of, you can see the Cubist influence in this painting with the reliance on just kind of geometric shapes, multiple viewpoints, so it looks like the figure is actually moving through the composition. This is what was Robert Henry was a leading American artist at the time. So you can see that he was very realistic in his painting, kind of a society painter, doing a lot of portraits, but he was a very influential teacher. You know, so a lot of younger artists would actually look to him, and also to Thomas Eakins. On the right is a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, one of those artists who came under the influence of the modernist abstraction style, you know, and her paintings became more and more abstract as her career progressed. So another prominent American was John Singer Sargent, who actually last spring, I believe it was, there was a major exhibition of his watercolors at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston. But anyway, Sargent was a expatriate. He lived most of his career in Europe, you know, and he was wealthy enough that he didn't, he could go on these kind of artistic trips and paint, you know. But this is his painting called Gassed, which is a very big painting. You know, it's I think close to 10 feet long. I don't include the dimensions here. But he was commissioned to create this work along with, I think there were 7 other English artists who were commissioned to kind of record their experiences of the war. You know, this painting I really like because it reminds me of an earlier painting in history, Bruegel's Blind Leading the Blind. But it is kind of beautifully staged, I think. In the foreground you have men, you can't tell if they're wounded or if they're actually deceased. You know, they're just kind of laying almost on top of each other completely. You have 3 groups of soldiers kind of being led to a hospital ward. And then in the background, kind of, I don't think you can make it out, but back here, there's another group of soldiers playing soccer, football. You know? So he's kind of, and he actually went to the front lines, went to a hospital, made sketches and drawings. So this is direct observation. You know, he was one of those who just kind of observed the war from a distance. You know, but here he creates a really wonderful composition. You know, so another really noted American was Henry Osawa Tanner. By the time of the World War, World War I, Tanner was a well-known expatriate African-American living in Europe, in France. Had his home and studio established there. He was the leading African-American painter during the 19th century, you know, and very well noted. He actually left the U.S. because he realized the prejudice would hold him back. You know, he studied under Thomas Eakins, one of the leading artists and teacher, U.S. artists and teacher, and he, through a series of events, managed to establish his career in Europe. You know, he traveled a few times back to the United States to receive accolades, to sell some of his work, to exhibit some of it. But he lived in Europe, where he was a little more accepted. And artists at this time would make pilgrimages. Once they were done with art school, they would go to Europe to see the masters, to see the classics. And Tanner was one of those artists that his studio is often visited by younger artists. So this painting, The Banjo Lesson, you've probably seen somewhere. It's featured a lot, you know, just in books, talking about this time period, you know. And it's a very classic scene, you know, kind of the elder instructing the younger person, but it was also a scene that was one of ridicule, you know. Postcards, you would find images of the happy black man playing the banjo, and that's what this refers to. But Tanner has managed to kind of reverse it and make it a very noble painting, very classic in style, and it received tons of accolades, you know. Let's see. He was too old to participate in World War I as a soldier, so And he was very disturbed by the war. He was living in France and in fact had to evacuate a couple of times to go to England where it was safe because there was fear that his home would be overrun by the Germans. So he writes about being unable to create artwork while friends, colleagues, fellow artists were in the service, in the military, being killed, and being wounded. So all he was able to do artistically was create sketches. Finally, he had the idea of going to the Red Cross and starting a community garden near one of the hospitals near his home. And this was kind of his service, helping the soldiers heal, by having this community garden that they could tend to and talk with each other, exercise a little bit and so forth. So it was a very successful venture and kind of the only way Tanner was able to contribute to the war. So these smaller paintings were created after the war in 1918. And they're scenes from his sketchbook, basically. The upper left is a drawing of soldiers being served at a canteen. The lower left is a night scene of soldiers visiting a house, and then you have soldiers marching, through town. So, as I said, these were completed after the war. Tanner was very religious. His father was a bishop, and in fact, the family had hoped that Tanner would become a preacher, but he showed such artistic promise at an early age. He devoted his life to that. But many of his artworks are kind of allegories. So here is the Good Shepherd. You can kind of see his painting style was very, very dense, but here you can kind of make out the figure of a shepherd carrying a lamb back to the flock. And Tanner actually kind of used this as an allegory, symbol of humanity, if you will. And it was written about as such. One of the reviews, it gives a vivid picture of desolation with the rugged hills in the background and all the struggling vegetation, barren and hopeless. His paintings, there was an exhibit of his paintings a little more than a year ago at a museum here in Houston, and his paintings are very, very thickly painted, but you can still make out some of the details in them. And he was a great experimenter. He tried to mix different concoctions of paints to create different effects, and some were more successful than others. But here, I don't recall the size of this painting, but it's not maybe a little more than 36 inches tall, but still he kind of evokes that landscape, just kind of desolation. Another very famous artist was Edmonia Lewis, a sculptor, also African American, also one who established a studio in Europe. A result of the prejudice she felt she received actually here in the United States. But her noble classical sculpture here out of marble, Forever Free, was kind of a blend of styles. You have a classical style, but you also have the Negro suffering, depicted here. And then I think the last slide I have is Laura Wheeler Waring. one of the knocks against African Americans at this time from the art world, critics, was that there was no way that Negroes could do anything comparable to, you know, the white man in terms of art. You know, they couldn't handle the material. You know, so here is a portrait of Laura Wheeler Waring that has a little bit of loose brushwork. It's a very textural painting also. You can just kind of make out in the dress the brushwork going on. But this is an example of an artist who was fully competent, able to do portraits that were successfully sold, you know, and this during, well, her time came a little bit after the World War I. So that's just kind of a very simple overview of the visual arts at this time. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Green. Now we'd like to ask Dr. Merlene Petrie to present. And I'm going to... What's that?
I was saying if it doesn't go through, I can go on without it. Kind of close. This is something cheap. If it's not, I'll just go on without
Okay. Open.
it. It's stove. Half of them are leaving now anyway. I said half of them are leaving now. It's up here.
This is it? Okay, there you go.
Okay. My name is Merlene Petrie. I'm a professor in the Department of History. I have been asked to say a few words about African American World War I. World War I, just as World War II, will affect every facet of life in every country's history. And it also have a rippling effect. Just as World War I has causes, it also has results. And so today I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the results of World War I as to how it affected African Americans. America went to World War II on the side of the Allied powers in 1917. At the time it engaged in war, it was unprepared for the war. So therefore, there was need to pass a Selective Service Act. This Selective Service Act is the draft that we would have. At the time that the draft was passed, African American was suspended between slavery and citizenship. That is, the masses of African Americans could not vote. There was a high incident of lynching. The masses of African Americans were still tenant farmers in the South. Therefore, they were a little reluctant to go into war. But W.E.B. Du Bois, one of their leaders, wrote a memorandum to most of the leaders saying that we need to close rank. We need to be on the side of the Americans who are fighting against the Germans. We need to go to war in pursuit of democracy or to make the world safe for democracy. So because of this, African American closed rank, as he said, and they went to war as a result of the Selective Service. Now, what happened as a result of African Americans going into war? They fought gallantly in the war, but one of the results that came out of that was officer training school. African Americans would go into World War I in a separate army. They would have separate battalions, what have you. There were many African Americans who wanted to become officers, but there were no training camps for them. So therefore, a number of black leaders got together and petitioned Congress so that there would be training school, such as the ROTC for those individuals. And as a result of this, as a result of World War I, Tuskegee Institute, Prairie View University, and a number of others would begin to have officer training schools. So this is why you can go to Prairie View now to become a commissioned officer in the U.S. military. Also during World War I, a Houstonian who was the secretary of Booker T. Washington, most people know of Booker T. Washington. His name was Emmett J. Scott. He was, they named him as a special assistant to the Secretary of War. He were to go into the Army and find out any kind of discriminatory practice that was meted out to African Americans. But also, he investigated, as I said, discrimination in the Army. Also, there was a race riot here in Houston in 1917. The riot was primarily because troops were sent here, was stationed here in Houston, and a riot broke out between some of the soldiers and white civilians in Houston. Now, what was the result of that? The result of that was we had a revision of the NAACP chapter. The NAACP chapter, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was formed here in Houston in 1913, but it died for a lack of members. But as a result of this riot, there was a number of the NAACP national office came down and said there is a need for such so that we can investigate this riot. So as a result of that, you have the Houston chapter of the NAACP becoming a vibrant entity. It is this Houston chapter who is going to take the lead in helping blacks gain the right to vote or destroying the white primary in what is the case Smith v. Allwright. What did black soldiers do during the war? We said black soldiers fought gallantly in the war, won a number of medals. They also worked as stevedore and laborers before the white soldiers arrived. And they did a number of other things also. Also, there were black nurses who worked on the home front, many of whom were from Houston, and there were other organizations such as the YMCA and the YWCA. Then, remember, anytime you have a war except the last war, you're going to have a booming economy because the United States is the #1 producer of wartime materials. So the United States is going to enjoy a high standard of living. You have credit buy and automobile, all of this happening, but all of this is going to impact African Americans, this booming industry. As a result of this, we're going to have a great migration of blacks from the south to the north. This is the first time, only in the 1990s, the trend has been reversed. African Americans were going in great numbers for a number of reasons to the north. The main reason because you have wartime industry over there, and they can get work, and this is far better than picking cotton or working as a tenant farmer. So you have the great migration. As a result of this, the government would have a division of what at that call was Negro economy. And also you're going to have the masses of blacks who would leave the South going into New York, and they would be restricted to living in Harlem. So while the restriction was bad, some good came out of it because it was the cultural center for African Americans. You had a group of artists, a group of poets, a group of historians saying that we're going to write about African American civilization, culture, and history. And so out of that came what we call the Harlem Renaissance. You may have heard of some such as Claude McKay and a number of others. And as I mentioned, these are some of the things. Even jazz would come out of it. This is to say that jazz had long time been a main music, but this is the time where white Americans would come to accept it. And then you also have voices of protest. As a result of the World War I, you would have black women and black men coming back with a new attitude. They had interacted with people from different cultures who did not display the kind of discrimination that they found in this country. So they would come back with a nationalist spirit, talking about what was good about African American, and they were determined that they would not take some of the discrimination. This is why it was called a new black man and new black woman, because the year after the war came to an end, you would have what is known as a long bloody summer, race riot throughout the country because of those new black men and new black women. And of course you'd have the whole idea of black nationalism with Marcus Garvey and others who say that black is beautiful. All I'm saying that you had results of World War I, but you also have the rippling effect of World War I. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Merlene Petrie. So that concludes our program for today. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank all of our speakers in particular, so for your fine efforts today. So thank you, speakers. So let's see, I need to get your jump drive back here. Let me pull this out.
Okay,
There.
thank you.
Thank you then.
I like your presentation. I want to see a picture though. I don't read very well. Oh, okay. That's good.
Is Dr. Obie here? Oh, this is yours, okay. That's the smallest one I've ever seen.
Hey, Dr. Sellers.
Hey, thank you for coming. Good to see you again.
Oh,
All
yeah, this was good. Thank you for giving the opportunity for points.
right, great. So you sign in over there?
Yeah, I got it signed.
Okay.
I'll see you next week.
Okay, all right, bye-bye. Let's see here. Yeah, close this out, close this out. Hi, how are you doing? Thanks for coming today. Okay. Yeah. Okay, whose pen is this? All right, thank you.